بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه تعالى نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم آمين. Salam to everyone. Hope that you're doing well and having a blessed Ramadan, inshallah. So welcome to an introduction to Avicennian Aqida, Al-Khuṭba al-Gharrā lil-Shaykh al-Ra'is Qaddasa Sirra, as hopefully you can see on your screens. By the way, just apologies in advance for my sort of low voice. I have a bit of a cough and a sore throat. I caught the flu earlier and I'm still recovering. So, like I said, apologies for that. Please bear with me. So welcome to an introduction to Avicennian Aqida. This course offers an exploration of key theological and metaphysical doctrines found in the works of Ibn Sina, the most influential philosopher in the Islamic tradition, by pretty much consensus. Our primary text will be what I've translated as the Exalted Homily, or in Arabic, Al-Khuṭba al-Gharrā. This text goes by a couple of other names as well, but I think this is the most common one. It's a very interesting, profound, yet concise text that presents Ibn Sina's philosophical creed. So we're going to be going through that, and we're going to supplement it by selections from an anonymous Persian commentary that elucidates its deeper meanings. And I'll say a bit more about the text and the commentary in a bit. At the heart of this course, as we'll hopefully see throughout the course, lies Ibn Sina's distinctive approach to central themes of Islamic revelation. Things like the nature of God, or the origin, what he calls al-Mabda, the structure of the cosmos, and the final destiny of the human soul, what he calls the return, or al-Maʿād. Through careful readings and discussions, we'll examine his concepts of divine transcendence, unity, providence, as well as his arguments for the immateriality and immortality of the human soul. Excuse me. Our study will be structured around 7 key topics. 7 or 6, depending on whether I decide to combine certain things. We'll progress starting from the nature of divinity and creation to the nature of the human rational soul and the afterlife. Each week we'll engage with both Ibn Sina's own writings and an interpretation of it from this later anonymous commentator on his homily, with a view to, wherever relevant, kind of situating his distinctive takes within the broader context of Islamic intellectual history. And I'll say a bit more about that too shortly. What can you expect from this course? Well, a few things. First, a close analysis of the Exalted Homily in Arabic with English translations that I'll be providing. An exposure to a classical commentary in Persian, just to get a sense of how it looks and how it unpacks the text that it comments on. Philosophical discussions on divine attributes, cosmology, and the human soul, as well as a comparative engagement wherever I think relevant with some alternative views, right? Views that you may be familiar with or not. We'll do this just to bring out sort of the Avicennian view more distinctly. And then some assignments. I don't know how I feel about that yet, but we'll see. So maybe some assignments or maybe not, depending on certain factors. In any case, this course is designed to be, and will hopefully be, introductory, yes, but also to some extent rigorous. However, no prior knowledge of Ibn Sina or his thought is required, just a willingness to engage with some philosophical reasoning, you could say, or rational inquiry. So whether you come from a background in philosophy, Islamic studies, or theology, or even just totally something different, but you have an interest in these matters, this course will provide you with a solid foundation, inshallah, in Avicennian thought and its lasting influence. So that's the goal. Okay, so let me now turn to saying something about the author first, and then something about our base text, the Khutbah or the homily, and then something about the commentary, and then I'll end it there. And then I'll follow this video up with another one, which will be on actually the first lesson. So all of this is something just by way of introduction to delving into the actual text and the actual topics. Okay, so the author. Who's the author? Ibn Sina, the preeminent sheikh, or Avicenna, as he's known in the Latin and then more generally Western world. So I'll be using Ibn Sina and Avicenna, at my own discretion, right? So just sort of keep that in mind. His life. Let me first say something a bit about his life, some background info that might be of interest to you, and then I'll say something about his works, and then something about his key ideas, and then something about his influence. Okay, so his life. His full name is Abu Ali al-Husayn ibn Abdullah ibn Sina. He was born in 980 of the Common Era, or 370 of the Hijrah, in a little town just outside Bukhara in Central Asia. The little area is called Afshana. He passed away in 1037 CE, or 428 Hijri, in Hamadan, which is in present-day Iran. He was an early genius, having memorized the Quran by the age of 10, and mastered philosophy, medicine, and the rest of the sciences of his day by the end of his teens, right? Which is pretty remarkable. He himself tells us that in his autobiography. Having done that, he went on to become a court scholar and a physician for some time. Served in various courts as a vizier, as well as a doctor, and moved around a lot, actually, often due to political instability, right? He was a prolific writer. In the tradition, about 450 works are attributed to him. Of course, not all of them are authentic, but maybe more than 100, 150 of them are, maybe even more. I mean, I haven't really researched that in any rigorous way, but I've read some things here and there. Some people say 100, some 150, others over 200. But we have, from these 450 works attributed to him, we have about 240 of them on a variety of subjects that survive. As regards his works, he has some major works and then some lesser known works. Some of his major works are books like the Kitab al-Shifa, which is a vast philosophical, people call it an encyclopedia, but it's not really that. It's like this systematic, sustained book on all the branches of philosophy at the time. So it covers 4 major areas: logic, natural philosophy, mathematics, and metaphysics. So that's one of his major works. And then there's another work called Al-Najat, Kitab al-Najat, the deliverance or the salvation. This is a much shorter work on his philosophical system, right? Covering all the fundamental bases. Some people say it's a summary of the Shifa, but I don't really think so. It contains a lot of new material that's not in the Shifa. In some places, you could say that, but I don't think as a whole it's supposed to be or was written as a summary of the Shifa. It's an independent work written with a different purpose and a different audience even in mind. And then there's another major work, third major work, which is the Al-Isharat wal-Tanbihat, the remarks and admonitions. It's one way it's translated. This too is a work in which all the major parts of his system are covered, but in a very unique style, right? That's one of the reasons why this text is very influential among later thinkers. One way it was influential is that it became subject to a lot of commentaries. And one of the reasons for that was because of the style in which it was written. We might look at some passages from it if I see a need for it. And then among his lesser known works, there are many, but this treatise that we're looking at, this homily that he wrote, this is considered to be among one of the lesser known works. Okay. And as I said, it's a concise theological, metaphysical treatise on divine transcendence and the order of being and the rational soul. It contains in like compact form, very condensed form, the major features of his philosophy, of his system. What about key ideas of his? Well, there are several in various areas. I'll just list a few in each area, right? So if we look at metaphysics as a discipline, Ibn Sina made very profound contributions in that discipline. And one of his key ideas here is the concept of God as the necessary existent. And we'll say more about that later, in the first session of our text. Another is his emanationist cosmology, right? This idea that reality flows from God through a hierarchy of entities, and we'll look at that too in a bit more detail when we come to it in the actual section of the homily he alludes to. Another major idea is what's known as the rule of one, qa'idatul wahid. This is a fundamental metaphysical principle of his system. We'll look into this as well because he discusses it in the homily, mentions it. This is the idea that, to put it very tersely, that from something that is simple or the same in every way, you can only get one thing. Okay, and again, I'll say more about that. Just keep that in mind for now. Don't wonder about it too much. For those for whom it's something that they haven't heard of before. So that's in metaphysics. Those are some key ideas in metaphysics. In psychology, there's his very famous the floating man argument, or thought experiment as it's called, which is supposed to be, well, there are different interpretations about what it's supposed to show, but I think there's a general agreement that one thing it's supposed to show is that who we are fundamentally is something different from our bodies. Okay, so this is an argument that he developed to argue for what's known today in contemporary philosophy of mind as substance dualism. Another notable idea is his very rigorous argumentation for the human soul having a definite post-mortem existence. This was something even very radical in his own time, because a lot of his, and I'll mention something about this again when we come to it in the relevant section of his homily, where he sort of disagrees with his philosophical predecessors on this question, and arguably even Aristotle himself. Okay, like I said, I'll say more about that when we get there. In epistemology, it's another area in which he had very interesting and distinctive views, highly original, like the distinction between the different stages of intellectual cognition. We'll get there too, say more about that. Another area is natural philosophy. Two key ideas here are his anti-atomism. Okay, the idea that material reality is fundamentally discontinuous. That is to say, that it consists of, some kind of fundamental, unfurther analyzable, or rather, further unanalyzable parts, right? He rejects that idea, and that idea was very common in his time, especially among the Muslim theologians. We'll get into this a bit too. And the other idea is his hylomorphism, right? Which is his sort of positive account as to the fundamental nature of material reality. Okay, and we'll say a bit about that too. Okay, so that's just a bit by way of some of his key ideas. Like I said, we'll go into some of them more when we get to the relevant sections of his treatise. Okay, now let me say a bit about his influence on later thought. So his influence is actually very profound. It was an influence on, obviously, the Islamic world, for one, but also on the Christian scholastic tradition, because his works were, or some of his major works, or large parts of his major works were translated into Latin around the 13th century, and his ideas became, intensely debated among Christian thinkers in the Latin world. But in the Islamic world, he was a foundational figure for a lot of later thinkers, both philosophers and theologians. Philosophers like Suhrawardi, Mullah Sadra, right? Their distinctive schools and approaches owe a lot to him, as well as, important theologians like Razi. He also had a profound influence on the whole mystical tradition, both in its poetic, practical form, as well as its sort of prose theoretical form, right? But especially the theoretical, what's called theoretical Sufism, or later on Irfan al-Nazari. In the Latin tradition, as I said, his works shaped medieval Christian philosophy because they influenced its most important exponent, Aquinas, right? In addition to others as well, like, Albert the Great or Duns Scotus, and even as far as Suarez, which is the 16th century, right? And that's just his philosophical influence. But he also had a very profound influence in medicine, right? You hear often about his canon of medicine, which is his most important medical work, being taught in Europe up until the 17th century, right? So he advanced the discussions in all these fields to a very significant extent, and you can gauge that by his influence on both these traditions, the Islamic East especially, and the Christian West. And so it's because of that, I think it's very important to study Ibn Sina today. There are several reasons for that. Right? One is just, and this is arguably the most important in my view, the intrinsic value of his thought. By which I mean, he gives you a very profound, his thought gives you a very profound, systematic, explanatory framework for understanding the world. Right? That's one reason. Another is just the relevance of his thinking or his teaching for appreciating and grasping core Islamic theological teachings like Tawheed, right? His approach to that, which is central, right, for the Islamic religion. Anyone who's a Muslim must take Tawheed seriously, and Ibn Sina has a lot to say about this idea of Tawheed, which is different in important ways from what other intellectual traditions say about it within Islam, right? Not to mention outside of Islam. There's also a historical interest for studying Avicenna today, right? Because he kind of bridges the Greek, Islamic, and Christian intellectual traditions in important ways. And then there's also a kind of contemporary interest for anyone that happens to be sort of up to date and following contemporary philosophy. its various disciplines, right? So his rational approach to theology and metaphysics remains, I think, very relevant in, say, philosophy of religion, right? Or in contemporary metaphysics, or his, psychology is very important for contemporary philosophy of mind, for discussions in that. All right, so for all these reasons, I think that it's crucial to study the Sheikh. And that's a picture of him, as you can see. Okay, so that's enough about the author. Let's move on to our text, or a base text, what's called the Matin, right? Which is the actual homily itself. Al-Khuṭba al-Gharrā. Let me say a few words about that text. Okay, here's a picture from a section of it from one of the manuscript copies. So I'll say something about what this homily is about, why is it important, and why study it. But before answering these questions, let me mention something that might be of interest. It concerns a controversy surrounding this homily that Avicenna wrote in his own time. And this is something we gather actually from a letter Avicenna wrote to one of his students, most likely Bahmanyar, in which he responds to accusations that he attempted to imitate the style of the Quran in his philosophical homilies, right? And especially this particular one, Al-Khuṭba al-Gharrā. These critics argued that, the highly kind of rhetorical and elevated language, and we'll get a sense of some of this when we begin to read the homily, of this text and other similar texts. They argued that or complained that that kind of language bore, too much of a resemblance to the Quran, right? Which raised, in their eyes, concerns about Ibn Sina's intentions. So in this letter, Avicenna defends himself by saying that no, his goal was not to replicate or rival the Quran, but rather to present philosophical and metaphysical truths in a way that resonates with a broader audience. So he explains that, the elevated style serves to inspire reflection and convey complex ideas effectively, rather than to challenge, divine uniqueness of the Quranic revelation or something like that, right? And there's actually a good article about this in French about this whole controversy and the context of it, and what it involved, by Yahya Michaud, who is a very important Muslim intellectual historian. His analysis in this article contextualizes this Avicennian apology or defense of these kinds of writings of his, showing how the Sheikh navigates the boundaries between philosophy and religious discourse, right? So he highlights how Avicenna, despite his rationalist approach, was very mindful actually of theological sensitivities, and he sought to clarify that his use of this certain kind of language, which is a very kind of high rhetorical style, was more a pedagogical choice than an act of religious imitation or anything of the sort. I'll upload this article by Michaud onto Google Classroom as well, along with several other documents, and then those of you that are interested and can read French, you could have a look at it. I'll also upload my summary of it for those that don't read French, so that might be of use to you guys. This letter that he wrote to his student, in which he defends himself against these accusations, it's actually called an epistle contesting the accusation of having plagiarized the Quran. That's sort of one way to translate it. And actually, I'll just summarize some points from it because I think it might be useful. Let me see here. So, yeah. So, Michaud suggests that when he's discussing the historical context of this letter, he says that it was written sometime during Avicenna's stay in Isfahan around 415 to 421, which is 1024 to between 1024 and 1030 with a common era, right? which is to say then that this homily that we'll be looking at is earlier than that, perhaps 2-3 years earlier than that. or maybe even during that time, right? Maybe not even like a year earlier. And if that's right, then this homily, which will be our base text, it's a pretty late work by Ibn Sina, because Ibn Sina dies in 1037. So if that's the case, then it really represents kind of his mature thought, right? The epistle Michaud says is actually a response to the accusation of one scholar in particular, who was a competitor of Avicenna at court, and him and Avicenna had actually several bad exchanges. There were a lot of feuds between them. His name was Abul Qasim al-Kirmani, right? So he's the one that accuses Ibn Sina of imitating the Quran in these sermons or homilies. And Michaud argues that these accusations were part of a broader professional rivalry between the two. So Michaud says that as regards the content of the epistle, Avicenna defends himself against the accusations, arguing that his sermons were original and not intended to mimic the Quran. He criticizes Kirmani for spreading these falsehoods and for his ingratitude, recalling how he had previously helped him in some professional capacity. He also mentions that Avicenna discusses the nature of his sermons more generally in this letter, which were meant to address, he says, theological and philosophical issues, including, the unity of God, prophecy, and even the refutation of various religious groups, especially non-Islamic religious groups like the Sabians, Magians, Christians, and Jews, right? Which is actually very interesting, because people don't really, even in like the academic world, those who specialize in Islamic intellectual history, they don't really know this side of Ibn Sina, that he actually dealt with such issues, critiquing, proponents of alternative religious traditions. You don't really find this, at least not to this extent, in Ibn Sina's Islamic philosophical predecessors, right? Like in the second teacher, Farabi. One of the other things Michaud highlights is the religious and philosophical depth of Avicenna's sermons, emphasizing their role in defending Islamic doctrine against various heresies. He also notes Avicenna's passion for writing and his attention to literary style more generally, which is actually one of the reasons why historians say he was very influential. It's because he wrote in various literary genres and styles, right? So that his work, his thought had a very wide audience and reception, right? And because of this, writing and sort of trying out different literary styles, this is what may have led to the accusations of imitating the Quran, right? Because the Quran has a certain stylistic feature to it, and and someone who knows that well might be able to see a resemblance to it in the prose of this homily or sermon we'll be looking at. And then finally, Michaud concludes the article with a discussion of this letter that Ibn Sina wrote to his disciple. This concludes with a discussion of the significance of this letter for understanding, Avicenna's intellectual but also professional life, right? Okay, good. So yeah, like I said, I'll upload it and then you can look at the details yourself. Okay, let's get to these questions now. So what is the Exalted Homily about? Well, like I said, it's supposed to be a concise yet deep theological metaphysical treatise, right, which explores divine transcendence, the structure of reality, and the nature of the rational soul, right? It presents a philosophical articulation of, you could say, monotheism, Tawheed, right, but one grounded in Avicenna's metaphysical system. It discusses the order of being, from God to the celestial intellects and the material world, and it explores the human soul's origin, nature, and ultimate return to God. Okay, and this it does like in a very literary, condensed form. Right? It doesn't unpack. The unpacking is what the commentators do, and like I said, we'll look at one of them. So that's what the homily is about. Okay, why is it important? Well, it provides a couple of reasons. It provides a philosophical framework for understanding central theological principles of Islam. It serves as a bridge between Quranic monotheism and rational metaphysics. I think this can be clearly seen there, just by the language that's used, and which is both religious on the one hand, but also philosophical, and they're intermixed. It offers an explanation of divine transcendence, which emphasizes God's absolute unity, okay? And it also clarifies the relation between divine causality and creation, addressing specifically the issue of how God's oneness relates to the multiplicity that we experience in the world. And like I said, it demonstrates Avicenna's distinctive approach to the soul's nature. So, the divine transcendence, creation in the cosmos, and the human soul, all of these are very much Quranic notions, themes, ideas, right? And Ibn Sina expresses them in this homily in his own distinctive way. Okay, so why should we study it? Well, several reasons. One, understanding monotheism, right? Because in it, Avicenna aims to articulate the Quranic concept of divine unity. Two, divine transcendence and the Quranic vision of God, you could say, right? Because Avicenna takes himself to be, as I just noted, expounding the Quranic doctrine of divine transcendence, right? Emphasizing things like God's atemporal nature, his non-spatial nature, and his lack of composition. And we'll get into the details of these more in the relevant places of the Khutbah, and especially with a view to seeing the contrast between his account of these matters and certain alternative views, right? Especially the views that, for one reason or another, have sort of taken center stage in our time. A third reason is to get a sense of sort of like philosophy and religion in dialogue, right? Because one could say that the text is an important example of Avicenna's attempt to reconcile reason and revelation. Okay? And in this respect, it can help students understand how Islamic philosophy engaged with theological ideas or themes, and thereby shaped later Islamic tradition. A fourth reason is the nature and destiny of the human soul, right? We take away something about that from a study of this text. Avicenna's arguments for the soul's immateriality and immortality specifically, right, which contribute to Islamic and broader philosophical discussions on issues like personal identity and, post-mortem existence or the afterlife, right? Again, very central Quranic theme. And then finally, there's also historical significance, right? Because later scholars, including theologians, mystics, and other philosophers, engage deeply with these Avicennian views, right? So studying the Exalted Homily offers insights into the long-standing debates between proponents of these various turuq, or paths. In sum, we could say by engaging by engaging with the Exalted Homily, we gain a deeper appreciation for Ibn Sina's philosophical vision, right? His attempt to rationally articulate central Quranic themes or doctrines, and also get an appreciation for the enduring influence of his ideas on broader Islamic intellectual history. Okay, so as I said, this is like a manuscript, a snapshot from a manuscript of this Khutbah. And here, this other snapshot, this is a list of all the known manuscripts of this work in various universities around the world, right? It's a pretty extensive list, which is to say, one thing is that this Khutbah was very popular, right? One way you can gauge the popularity of a given work is by the amount of manuscript copies of it available. So it was a pretty popular work. In fact, so popular that even by the time of Ghazali, right, which is 12th century, early 12th century, I think, we already have a Persian translation of this khutbah. Okay, and that was done by none other than Hakim Umar Khayyam, right, who was actually a follower of Ibn Sina's school. He was an Avicennian philosopher. Not a lot of people know that about him. And I'll also upload Khayyam's Persian translation of the work, just for those that are interested in looking at it. It's a very nice text. It's a translation and also a bit of a gloss as well. So you can have a look at that yourself once I upload it. But yeah, so this is an indication of the popularity of the work. Okay. Let me now say something briefly about the commentary. So the commentary is called Sharh Khutbah al-Gharrā Ibn Sina. As I said, we don't know who the author is, right? It was probably some Avicennian, but we do know when it was probably written, right? The editor of the of the commentary says that, the manuscript evidence indicates that it was probably written, 13th century and after, or 7th Hijri and after. Okay, it's divided into 15 chapters, and we'll have a look at them briefly in a moment. And there are at least 2 manuscripts of this work, right? And the editor, Abdullah Nurani, he based his edition. By the way, I'll upload this as well to Google Classroom. And we're going to be working off of the base text that's contained in this commentary by this anonymous commentator. Okay, so the commentary contains both Ibn Sina's text as well as the commentary, and we'll be working off of that. And if we ever need to appeal to any of the other editions, we'll have a look at them too. Okay, one last thing before we close off here. The topics to cover based on the commentary. Let me pull that up here. I don't know if you guys could see the text. Okay, good. Hopefully it's visible. So there are 15 chapters or discussions here, right, which I've organized here into 7 weeks, and I've called them the following. So the first week, which will be the video that follows this one, it'll be on divine names and divine transcendence. Week 2, we'll be looking at divine aseity, and I'll explain what that means, and atemporality. Week 3, we'll delve into divine unity, omnipotence, and providence. Week 4, divine action, which is to say creation and the rule of one that I briefly mentioned earlier. Week 5, the created order, celestial and terrestrial. Week 6, the human soul, its substantiality and immateriality. And then finally week 7, which will also be on the human soul, its incipience, relation to the body, and immortality. All of these topics are based on the different contents of Ibn Sina's khutbah itself. Okay, so with that, let me stop here. If anybody has any questions, we'll have them addressed, hopefully, on the Google Classroom's platform. So you could just, once I upload all these files there and invite you to the relevant classroom, you could raise any questions, concerns you have there, and then I'll follow, like I said, this video up with another one on the first section, inshallah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.